Paul, welcome to the show. You're Dr. Paul Moon, are you?
Yes, I am.
Good on you. Thank you for that. And we're talking about something extraordinary from, I think, the Pope in the 14th century, which incredibly now some Maori seem to believe has relevance to New Zealand. Could you take us through that, please?
Well, look, it boils down to being just a completely absurd claim. The claim is that in 1493, a Pope issued a papal bull, an edict or an instruction, and he did, to colonise parts of what was known as the New World at the time. It was really to sort out what Spain and Portugal were doing in that part of the world. It was not effective. In fact, the following year it was basically replaced by a treaty between Spain and Portugal, and that was the end of the matter. But it's been resurrected in the 20th century, and now more so, as the basis of a claim that this idea of how you colonise somehow influenced how Britain colonised New Zealand. That's the essence of their argument.
Now, I wouldn't take this seriously, but for the fact that one of the Human Rights Commissioners, or somebody who works as a General Manager of Policy, has attached her name to this particular claim as well, and by association, the Human Rights Commission as well. Does that concern you?
It's hugely concerning because the Commission is charged with, among many other things, providing accurate information to the public. I've just finished a 7,000-word report for Commission on this very point, and look, there are disputes in history. No one is particularly surprised by that. But this isn't about a dispute of interpretation or whatever else. This is about a completely fictitious argument, one that has no basis in evidence. And the fact that the Human Rights Commission is promulgating this argument without evidence is concerning.
Yes, because at the end of the day, the Human Rights Commission is paid by us to protect all of us from unjust actions of others. This is the Doctrine of Discovery we're talking about, yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, late 15th century, I think it was. The historicity, if you like, of the Doctrine of Discovery, you're saying that it was dead almost as soon as it started, and it was part of the expansion of Europe, wasn't it, as the Spanish and the Portuguese took off and discovered new lands. But can I ask why these people, do you think, would take the Doctrine of Discovery, something from the Catholic Church in the 15th century, and seek to graft it onto New Zealand?
I'm not sure what the motive is. I do know that it reflects a really impoverished understanding of history. Even if we put aside that Doctrine of Discovery, and let's say that it did apply to the Catholic communities around the world, and let's say it did encourage Catholic countries to conquer non-European lands and subjugate their populations, let's say it had that effect. That certainly wasn't the case in New Zealand. If you look at the instructions for the treaty, for example, that Britain issued in August 1829, it said the chiefs are to sign this agreement with what they call free and intelligent consent. This isn't an invasion. This is introduction of British law in New Zealand by Indigenous consent. Cook's instructions in 1768, just as he was leaving to come here, he was told that he could claim New Zealand if it was unoccupied, but if it was occupied again, he had to get, I think the phrase was, the consent of the natives. So Britain had the opposite policy from this Doctrine of Discovery. They didn't claim to have discovered New Zealand at any time. They said, we acknowledge it has an Indigenous population, we acknowledge that population has rights, and we will respect those rights. So as for the motive, I'm really puzzled. The report I wrote for the Human Rights Commission, I actually got it blind peer reviewed, which means that academics from other universities, and I don't know what their identities are, this was all arranged so I don't know them, they could speak honestly about my report. They looked at what the Human Rights Commission had produced that I was reacting to. They looked at the Human Rights Commission's report called Maranga Mai, and they said they could not believe that such a poor piece of scholarship was ever published. They were shocked by it. And I'm scratching my head looking at it too, because it would fail a very basic history test.
Now, the history of this, for our listeners, Paul, is that, as I understand, Mana Jackson, the Maori activist, went to the United Nations and argued this, and that the United Nations, and this will sort of get you going, or the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, in May 2012, noted the ongoing impact of the discovery document on Indigenous peoples and the right to redress. Quote, that 15th century Christian principle was denounced throughout the session as the shameful root of all the discrimination and marginalisation that Indigenous peoples face today. Now, that was a United Nations declaration in May 2012. That would seem, I guess, to be the political background for it, yeah?
Very much so. And again, it's completely devoid of any historical context. And really, it's embarrassing that the UN would stoop to that level to make those sorts of statements, because just about every historian I've talked to who works in this field, and that includes historians overseas, they're all scratching their heads wondering what on earth is happening here, because in every basis, historically, circumstantially, evidentially, any document you look at, it just doesn't fit. You can't make a compelling argument. What's happening is people essentially have now got to the point where they're making up history. They're saying, we think this happened, therefore it happened.
Now, there's something else. We were just talking before about a Maori healer, I use that word loosely, called Alexander Phillips, who I remember being portrayed to me as the latest Ratana, or the last Maori prophet, in actual fact, about 15, 16 years ago, based in Auckland. And that raised the Tonga Suppression Act. Now, you've written a lot on New Zealand history. The Tonga Suppression Act is regarded as, and has been interpreted, I've just had people text me this morning, for example, as a classic illustration of when Europeans decided that Maori should not have their own spiritual or cultural beliefs. What was the nature of the Tonga Suppression Act, please?
Well, the first point to note, of course, is that it wasn't a European initiative. It was actually driven by Maori MPs in Parliament. They were the ones behind this. In fact, there's a very famous passage, it's in Hansard, you can look it up, a debate on this topic. And the Maori MPs, Hone Heke Ngāpua, for example, is joking about Maori spirits and the Maori spirit of whiskey and so on. So he didn't take it particularly seriously, but the key point of it was not to control all Maori spiritual beliefs and suppress them. The key point was to do away with the fraudulent tohunga, and there were some, those people who claimed to have healing powers but didn't, and were preventing some Maori communities from accessing medicine. And these Maori MPs felt this was a danger to their people, and they needed to regulate these errant tohunga, and hence the Act. So it wasn't about suppressing a whole culture. You wouldn't get Maori designing this Act and voting for it if that was the case.
And you're an historian. You're intrigued me, because most historians probably sit comfortably on the centre or liberal left of any political divide or continuum. You seem to be an historian, Paul, that has made his reputation by saying, I'm not going to take a political view, I'm just going to report the facts, ma'am. Do you find it frustrating sometimes that there are historians that have already reached their view before they actually look at the facts?
I find that unprofessional, and I hope there aren't many of them. I have very little interest in politics, but certainly that the discipline requires that we base our conclusions on evidence. And if you get carried away doing something else, if you predetermine the outcome and then arrange the evidence to fit that outcome, I don't think you are a historian anymore, you're a propagandist.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. Listen, the other thing, I'm sorry, just to explain, I did an honours degree in history at Otago University a long time ago. Started doing a doctorate, but unlike you, didn't have the resolve to conclude it. But I'm interested in the idea, though, and the thing that irritates me, and I must irritate you, is people trying to take 2023 sensibilities back 100 years or 200 years, even 50 years, and impose the values of today, and when judging the actions of then. How does that strike you?
Again, it's an area that's deeply unprofessional. It's called Prisonism, and you do exactly what you've described. You take our values today and you say, well, look, we're going to condemn such and such 200 years ago because that person didn't act the way we think they should act. Now, if you do that, then 100 years from now, of course, or 200 years from now, people are going to condemn us by the same measure. It's a silly way of going about things. You have to judge actions and motives in the context of the time they were made, not through the benefit of hindsight and reading history backwards effectively.
Well, and that it raises the next issue of whether or not you have statues to, for example, Cecil Rhodes sitting at Oxford or Cambridge University or not. You could go through a number of historical, statues in New Zealand and say, does that person deserve to be there? I had that issue, of course, in Wanganui with John Ballance. But is there a stage at which you can judge these historical figures, at which you can say, you know what, we are commemorating the wrong person?
Well, a couple of issues there. Firstly, are we commemorating them? And I used the example of the statue of George Grey in Auckland that I've never seen. Every time I'm going past, I've never seen anyone saying, well, look, we're going to pay homage to George Grey, we're going to lay a wreath or something at the base of this. No, it's just there as a reminder of the way people felt about him at the time the statue was erected. That's as far as it goes. So these aren't places of pilgrimage or worship for anyone. So I don't think they have the power that perhaps some statues overseas have. But there's a real danger if you start stripping away things like statues. What's next? And are people bad? Well, yes, we're all bad. We've all sinned. Famous passage in New Testament. We've all sinned. So you could condemn absolutely anyone. But these are echoes of the time in which they were made. And I think mature people, grown-up people, see them for that and not much more.
And while I've got you here, and thank you for coming on the show because you are such an erudite man, and that is, I'm interested in the new history curriculum that is going to be taught. Now, I've got a daughter who's in year 12, loves history. I've got a son who's in year 10. I've had a daughter who's just left school last year, will study history, probably at Auckland University, ironically, in the next year or so. I'm interested in the history curriculum that, and good on Jacinda Ardern, she said New Zealand needs to learn its history. That's cool. She's right. But, and the idea of compulsory learn the history curriculum. But at the moment, from your outsider's perspective, because I don't imagine you are involved in constructing that curriculum.
No.
Where does it need to start?
Well, there are two problems with it. Firstly, the curriculum was very much an ideological exercise and it's been heavily criticised. The ministry then handled the process of criticism very poorly. It didn't really change anything about it. And worst of all, I suppose, is that the workload, the heavy lifting for this curriculum has now been dumped on teachers. So they're having to devise whole chunks of curriculum because the original one was just a mess, really. I think the biggest concern with it, putting aside what should and shouldn't be in it, because everyone has their preferences, are the substantial omissions. So we have 400 or 500 years of Maori history gone. That's just not there. Women's history, economic history, foreign affairs history, religious history, you go through the list. These are all absent. It's a very, very narrow curriculum, and its focus seems to be on colonisation and how the country is reacting to that ever after. And that's a great topic to analyse, but it shouldn't be the only one.
So anything that happened before 1840, in essence, is out, Paul?
I think there's mention of Cook, but look, there's a huge amount of documentary evidence being produced by the Waitangi Tribunal, for example, on hapu and iwi history, and to exclude that seems bizarre. It's almost like New Zealand's history starts with colonisation and then that becomes the overarching topic for us to consider. And there's so much more that's missed out, and that's a shame. I
agree. Now, you've written a number of books on New Zealand's early history. When did you start? Did you start pre-European?
No. Most of the stuff is really to do with the 19th century, with just facets of our colonisation.
Right. So the Musket Wars, I mean, what happened before 1840? I've always got a thesis, and so I've got a historian on. You're skilled in this area, so I'm going to test this thesis. When the treaty was signed in 1840, I'm assuming that it froze, or at least attempted to freeze at that time, tribal boundaries or rohe, and that if in the 10 years previous some iwi had come and taken over land that used to traditionally belong to another iwi because they had new Western technology, for example guns, that essentially that right of conquest was provided to them as of the treaty being signed on 1840. Have I got that right or wrong?
It's pretty much right, except that the decision to make those boundaries set in 1840 was actually made in 1975. One of the dying acts of the Bill Rowling government was, when the Treaty Waitangi Act was passed, was essentially to argue that the tribal boundaries, as they were in 1840, are the ones that we're going to deal with. So Auckland is a classic example where 100 years before the treaty was signed, some of the Tainui iwi were actually pushed out of Auckland by Ngāti Whātua. And they're pushed into the area of South Auckland. So tribal boundaries are in a state of flux for centuries, but 1840 has become the date where they're effectively sealed. And
listen, I've got Moriori background. Listen, so far distance, it's not funny. But yes, we feel a particular grievance, I have to say.
Yeah, and this is it. And those grievances last. But I think over time they're going to recede into something that won't be taken as seriously as it is now. And the reason I think that is because just about every other culture on Earth, bar a few, after several centuries, some of these smaller grievances do eventually evaporate.
Well, and that was the next question I was going to ask you. You're an historian, but sometimes an historian, just because looking at what seems to be a linear path from the past to the present, can sometimes just plot that linear path out into the future as well. The colonisation debate ain't going away. A whole series of people have become emboldened. The woke are not going to get unwoke. The Human Rights Commission, I can't imagine, despite criticism from you and I, is going to change its particular stance tomorrow, irrespective of a change of government that might or might not come in October. How do you see this playing out over the next 20 years?
Well, I'm not in the prophecy business, as you say, so I wouldn't venture too far, but I would say that there's a split in the road, as it were. In one way, there are people who are interested in history and interested in evidence and facts and interpretation of that evidence, and that's going to continue. But the other route, and it's an easier route to travel down, is the politicisation of history, where it's turned into a melodrama and when it's turned into almost a stick to beat people with. And facts are omitted if they don't suit the narrative. Facts are exaggerated that do suit the narrative. And look, there are telltale signs of this, but when you read some of these propaganda works, but I think that's where a lot of history is heading, and it seems to be in the public sphere, at least, that's what's getting the attention.
And finally, Paul, and thank you so much for spending time with us, but can I ask this?
Okay.
You are a professor of history at AUT, is that right?
That's right.
University of Technology. You teach, what's your specialty? Teaching undergraduates in?
New Zealand history, mainly in the 19th century. And
the kind of people who come to AUT, are they mostly international tour, or have you got a lot of locals as well?
No, almost all our students are local. We have a high proportion of Mare and Pacifica students, and a fairly large number of law students do history as well.
Right, it's a good idea. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Not
Have a very good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's Dr. Paul Moon, history lecturer from Dr. Paul Moon from the Auckland University of Technology. Sorry, it's our 8th university, by the way. We've got too many, but it doesn't matter. But yes, and the reason I've asked Paul onto the show was because this week the Human Rights Commission decided, well, at least had published, that obviously decided a long time ago, to take up this cause of something called the Doctrine of Discovery. You and I are paying for the Human Rights Commission and its senior policy staff to seek an apology from the Roman Catholic Church for providing the spiritual and philosophical justification for colonization. Have you ever heard of anything so absurd in your life? Probably not.